Welcome to this KHL webinar on retrofitting and sustainability, which is brought to you in association with Kingspan. My name is Mike Hayes. I'm the editor of Construction Europe, and this event will look predominantly, but not solely, at the situation in Europe as it relates to the decarbonisation of the current building stock. Now, given that 80% of the buildings that will be in existence in 2050 have already been built, ensuring that those buildings are energy efficient is a crucial requirement for the countries which have pledged to meet the Paris Agreement goals, i.e. the goals of keeping global warming to under 1.5 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, a new report from 3 Kiel, which is called the Global Retrofit Index, has revealed that the 6 countries analysed are so far falling well short of meeting their respective pledges. And the goal of decarbonising the current building stock is still a very distant one. So we'll be looking at this report in some detail over the course of the next 50 minutes to an hour. And I'm happy to say I am joined by a number of experts who will answer key questions on where we need to go from here to move closer to meeting net zero emissions targets. Before I introduce the first speaker, it's worth mentioning that questions from you are welcome. If you have a question, please just click on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, type your question and hit send, and we'll get to as many as we can in the time that's permitted. If your question is for a specific member of the panel, then please just put their name at the top of your message. Okay, so to set the scene for us, I'm going to hand over to Olwyn Smith, a principal consultant in 3 Kiel's climate change team and one of the authors of the Global Retrofit Index. Olwyn, welcome. Good to see you.
Many thanks, Mike, and thank you for having me here today. I'm going to just share my screen here and give a brief synopsis of the Global Retrofit Index. So let me just ensure that you can all see this screen correctly. Is that appearing for you? Good, seeing some nods and thumbs up, glad to hear it. So yes, hi everybody. I am, as Mike said, I'm Olwyn Smith. I'm a principal consultant with 3 Kiel, and we are a firm of sustainability advisors. And I'm delighted to give you an overview of this report we've written in collaboration with Kingspan, which is an interim report on the Global Retrofit Index, which is assessing the retrofit progress of 6 key countries on the path to net zero. So just to give you a little bit of background on the origins of this report, it's built upon the publication of the inaugural Retrofit Index, which came out late last year in 2022. And that was a large study which assessed and then ranked the performance of the G20 countries on retrofitting. And the results of that study showed slow progress really across the G20. The highest performing country analysed was Germany, and they just scored, Germany scored a 62 out of 100 possible score in that index. And so in light of that, and given the centrality of retrofitting to decarbonising, not just the buildings sector, but the whole global economy. We currently see that emissions from buildings make up over a quarter of energy related emissions globally. And so we've decided to do a follow-on report that dives in a bit more detail to 6 countries, many of whom were high performing in last year's report and index. And they are Germany, France, the Netherlands, the UK, the USA, and this year we added Ireland. And we were seeking to understand in a bit more detail how have the buildings emissions of these countries been tracking, also to add some EPC data analysis to supplement it. And finally, we wanted to be quite constructive in what we were analysing here and trying to draw out and spotlight some examples of where innovation is helping to overcome some key implementation barriers in the retrofitting challenge. So onto the key findings of the report, and really a headline takeaway is that across the 6 countries, emissions from buildings have been stalling, and the reductions that we were seeing earlier in the 2010s, especially in some of the European countries, as shown on the graph here, are beginning to stagnate somewhat. So you'll see the bottom 4 lines correlate to the European or the EU countries, I should say. And up until about 2014, there was quite good decline in buildings emissions. That is then flattening out. If you look at the UK, it's much more of a kind of plateaued situation across the whole decade. And most concerningly, in the USA, it's actually been on an upward trend, which is likely to continue. So that does set some alarm bells ringing given the size of that economy. Then the next key takeaway is looking into the EPC data that was available. So for UK, Ireland and France, we did have sufficient EPC data to run an analysis on the changes in EPC ratings on buildings between, in this case for Ireland, 2009 and 2022. The exact dates varied somewhat based on data availability. What the key takeaway here was that there, on a positive note, there has been some good uplift from the lowest levels of EPC ratings, those Fs and Gs up to the middle bands. But again, a bit of stagnation where we're not getting buildings up to that sufficient level of Bs and As where they're really energy efficient enough to be significantly reducing emissions. And that really comes through kind of whole building deep retrofitting usually. For Germany, we did another analysis which due to lack of EPC data publicly available, we instead looked at heating in residential buildings and found a huge dominance still there of fossil fuel heating. But looking more forward and to some of the solutions that are out there, I think it's fair to say that it's very clear many of the technological solutions to retrofitting are already in existence, so that's the good news. What we found really was that there are a lot of barriers to implementation, and some of those common barriers coming out were the investment, the capital and upfront investment required to retrofit buildings, problems with insufficiently sized or skilled workforces, and then also lack of awareness or maybe even some confusion as to availability of options amongst homeowners or building owners. We've seen some innovative schemes though that we do some case studies on in this report. Two of particular note in France and Ireland are really geared at trying to remove some of the friction for residential homeowners in that process of retrofitting, and to ensure that we're driving those deep retrofits as mentioned in the EPC slide. And just a final note on this slide really is to not that we have to avoid being blinkered, I think, in this analysis on just the carbon benefits of retrofitting. And I think in the framing of retrofitting can often be seen to be talked about along with the cost it entails, but there are so many co-benefits as well in terms of improved quality of life and comfort, as well as on that job creation side. So final slide from me then, just to summarize that in this report, we outlined what we view as 5 key elements of a successful framework for retrofitting. And I think many of these are in place across some of the countries, analysed to different extents, but it can be quite patchy, and there's the need for all of these aspects to work in unison to really accelerate the rate of retrofitting. So we need net zero building performance standards, a detailed national retrofitting plans, good financial supports, and also then, as I've talked about already, some of the need for upskilling and retraining of workforce. And then finally, this point on data transparency. If we're to hold particularly governments to account when it comes to performance on retrofitting, there needs to be consistent and comparable disclosure of data. So that's all from me. I'm going to hand things back over to Mike, and happy to take some questions. I believe you're still on mute, Mike.
Hopefully that's me unmuted. Okay, thank you, Owen. That's great. Some really interesting points and a lot of quite concerning data that I think we'll probably come back to fairly regularly over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. But before we do, let me introduce the rest of the panel. Just give me a second and we will see if we can see everyone. Hopefully you can see everyone on screen now. So let's run through them. First, we have Sue Arundale, Director General of EFCA, the European Federation of Engineering Consultancies. Welcome, Sue. Okay, Sue, and you can unmute as well and say hello.
Yeah, hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Nice to see you. Nice to see you, Sue. And we have Bianca Wong, Global Head of Sustainability at Kingspan Group. Welcome, Bianca.
Thank you, Mike. Hello, everyone.
And we have Adrian Joyce, Secretary General of EuroAce, an alliance of European companies targeting energy efficiency in buildings. Welcome, Adrian.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello, all. Okay, so as you can see, an array of speakers here with both industry and policy backgrounds. Perfect, just what we need. Olwyn outlined it briefly there, but I'm interested to know from your perspectives why retrofitting really matters. Bianca, I'll come to you first. What are your thoughts on that? Why does retrofitting really matter right now?
Sure. Well, retrofitting really matters as buildings are responsible for about 36% of all energy-related carbon emissions. And given that 80% of the buildings that will be standing in 2050 have already been built, retrofitting existing inefficient buildings has a key role to play in helping to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So therefore, tackling this issue heavily depends on hundreds of millions of successful building retrofits happening over the coming decades.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a massive task. Adrian, can I ask you the same question from the perspective of your members, maybe, and with regard to sustainability generally, how important is retrofitting?
We don't think it can be underestimated, the importance of retrofitting, not just for those large issues that Bianca has rightly pointed out just now, but there are many other benefits that come from retrofitting the stock, building resilience against climate change and the impacts, adapting our building stock to be suitable for the future, and bringing comfort and more healthy conditions to occupants in the buildings. But there's another benefit that really maybe needs to be looked at further, and that is the fact that buildings will be the hubs in a decentralized energy system pretty soon, because we're on the path towards electrification of everything. And unless our buildings are retrofitted to be highly energy efficient, the amount of new energy that would need to be rolled out will be enormous. Whereas if we take the nettle by the stalk now and do deep energy renovations of the building stock, we can reduce that demand into the future and therefore avoid huge capacity building and infrastructure building. So this is a multifaceted benefit for society at large, and we think a bit overlooked by politicians.
That is an interesting point, and another one I think that we'll be back to, where exactly this is seen in the scale of importance in terms of the global climate issues that we're facing. Sue, you've represented contractors and engineering consultants in Europe, and you're passionate about sustainability in construction. When you read this report, did you find it surprising? Did you find it disappointing? What's your reaction to the data that you see in this report?
Well, thank you for the question. Actually, I'm not surprised at all. It's depressing to admit that, but I worked for 8.5 years for the European Construction Industry Federation. I've now been with the consulting engineers for just over a year. And the EPBD, the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive, and Energy Efficiency Directive used to be two of my main files. And I worked on 2 revisions of the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive while I was at FIAC. As far as I can see, since I moved to EFCA, nothing has changed in terms of acceleration of the renovation rate. And I think, if anything, we're going backwards. And I think we're making a horrible mess of this. So I think we have a lot of work to do, and the report should be a wake-up call. But we know that there are many other things that policymakers are worried about, and we have to talk this up.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Okay, so taking a step back from this, maybe we should look at the size and the scale of this issue a bit closer. If we got things right, how much difference could retrofitting make to energy performance in terms of overall emissions from the built environment? In other words, what has to change for the analysed countries to achieve their stated targets? Olwen, can I ask you, what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I think the thing to really point out here is how central retrofitting is to reducing total building emissions, and I think that's maybe sometimes misunderstood. If we look at the UK specifically, the Climate Change Committee Net Zero Pathway there contributes 90% of total buildings emissions reductions to the retrofitting of buildings, and only 10% to embodied emissions in buildings. And I think there can often be more focus on greening of steel and cement production, which are relatively important things, but can take a lot of the attention, and they seem a bit more exciting, let's say, than retrofitting. But really, the central tool we have to decarbonise buildings, given that statistic that's already been mentioned about the 80% of buildings standing in 2050 already built today, is retrofitting. Yeah. And we should just say at this point, and I'll mention it again later, that if you didn't notice, the countries that have been analysed by 3 Kilo: Germany, France, the UK, Ireland, the Netherlands, and the USA. Okay, so these are the countries we're talking about. Okay, so what are the main barriers we're seeing to? Sorry, Adrian, come in on that.
Yeah, could I just come in on that? Because in the current revision of the Buildings Directive, which will impact on all but one of those countries that have been studied when it's adopted, there's going to be a new target to bring the entire building stock to what are called zero emission buildings by 2050. And in the definition as it's developing, because the negotiations are still ongoing, that will relate principally to operational emissions. And the best way to reduce operational emissions is to improve the energy efficiency of the building through retrofitting, and then switching to non-carbon sources of energy, whatever they may be. And this twin-pronged approach of efficiency and renewables or zero carbon sources is really the twin approaches that we need moving forward. And I think it's worth stating that when adopted, that target will become a large challenge for each member state to achieve, and that we really will have to focus minds and hearts on that challenge if we're to succeed. And I think we cannot afford but succeed.
Yeah, it's a good point. So taking that to the next step, what are the main barriers that we're seeing to implementing retrofitting on a global scale? Never mind the 6 countries in this report, on a global scale. Bianca, what do you think about this? What are the main barriers?
Sure, yeah, happy to start. I mean, it's a complex issue, and a number of items need to align for it to work well. So there are multiple barriers. It is expensive, that obviously needs to be acknowledged. Access to financing is crucial. The process itself can be quite invasive and disruptive, obviously, for occupants as well, which is another huge barrier. You need the right progressive policies to be outlined, as Adrian's covered already, and we are expecting to see more of that coming. And you need the right implementation mechanisms and plans in place as well. And then on top of all of those things, you need the resources, the supply chain, and skilled workforce as well to actually execute it correctly as well. So you really need those 4 or 5 things to be working and scaling at the same time to make sure that it's actually possible to carry out retrofits to the quality, I suppose, that they need to be taken to. An example would be in Ireland, is where I'm based. So more grants have been put in place, one-stop shops have been put in place to support homeowners, and that has scaled renovation. And we have a business as part of Kingspan that helps to provide services in that area. But what we can see is that the amount of renovations that are currently being carried out, which is half of what the government want to get to by 2026, is already stressing the system in terms of resources and skilled contractors to actually carry out that work. So a number of these things need to scale and ramp up over the next number of years to actually make it successful, I suppose, in the outcome, and that needs to happen in all countries, really.
So your take on this is that it's a little bit of everything that's lacking here. So there's not a one size fits all answer to this. Is that right?
Unfortunately, not. No.
Right. Sue, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. I do actually, because I agree that it's a number of things, but we have a very well acknowledged shortage of skilled workers. We also have a huge shortage of engineers as well. So we are struggling in our sector too. But as well as tackling the skills shortage, I think we have to start to focus on making the careers more attractive, because you know, people still have this bad perception about what this work involves, and it's not attractive, and young people don't want to go into it. But actually, the way that we do these things is changing, and we're using a lot more technology. And we should embrace that, because this is what interests young people. Even our engineers, believe it or not, are not so turned on by the standard civil engineering role anymore. They're very interested in how they can start to work with AI and things like that. I think the last thing I wanted to say on this, because I was actually reading a report this morning about this, and when retrofitting is done badly, for example, I was reading specifically about the case of heat pumps this morning. Apparently, when heat pumps are badly installed and then they don't work properly, apparently it's quite a skilled job to do this. Never done it myself, but it is quite a skilled job. If it's done badly, it doesn't work. And then people tell their friends, but yeah, we paid a fortune for this heat pump and now it's not working. And so it was a waste of money. And this is why we have to start valuing the kind of skill that we need to do this job. And I don't think we do that enough. And this has got to be changed, and it has to be promoted in schools so that young people start to think that there are many other career options, and doing things like this could be something that I would like to be interested in.
Yeah, that's really good stuff. Thanks, Adrian. I think I should bring you in on this as well. I mean, what are your members saying about this? Is it a skills issue? I mean, obviously it's a bit of everything, but primarily, is it a skills issue? Is it financing? Is it lack of direction from the top? What are you seeing?
So, Mike, you're not going to like my answer. I don't like addressing barriers. I think we're talking in the negative here, and actually building renovation or retrofitting is a positive for society. And yes, in my long career in the building sector, there have always been cyclical ups and downs, and Sue will recognize that as well. So I'm a bit more stoical about the current difficulties, although I recognize that there is a strong need to move away maybe from more of the traditional practices. And what I mean here is to embrace digitalization, to embrace offsite construction through mass customization of panels that can then give whole house or whole building retrofits in a matter of days, and avoid what Bianca referred to with the disruption that is often caused by a sequence of tradespersons coming to your house and first doing the installation, someone else doing the plastering, someone else doing the electric, someone else doing the plumbing, and in that sequencing you end up with difficulties that are not liked by building owners. So more innovation in our sector, more offsite construction that would make the sector much more attractive to younger and female workers, and there's a huge need in this area. And I have a suggestion that I've been making over the last couple of years that would, I think, change the mindset in the industry and among policymakers, and that is to define energy renovation of buildings as a separate industrial activity to construction. And then you might attract more venture capital, you might get more startups, you would certainly get more innovation in the sector. I see Sue smiling. I mean, I'm an ex-practicing architect, and I know very well that when you have a green field and you're asked to put a new building on that green field, you take a particular approach to the design challenge. When you're asked to take 1,000 homes in a district and renovate those homes that exist, your starting point and your whole approach is entirely different. So it could be defined as a separate industrial activity, given a separate attention away from the new build and the infrastructure build of the main construction activities, and therefore also change the image of this part of the works that we do to buildings moving forward. So rather than talk about the barriers, and there are solutions, by the way, to every barrier, and I much prefer talking about the solutions, I think understanding that we need a bit more dynamism, a bit more leadership in this sector is something I wanted to put out today. Because when you look at a pure statistical analysis, yes, you can get depressed. But if you take a forward-looking view and you realize the inevitability of renovating our building stock, then I think you can be hopeful and cheerful about this challenge and not get downbeat about it.
Well said. Well said. I'm going to upset you some more then now, because I think I'll turn to you, Sue, and talk about things on a governmental level or an EU level. I mean, do you think there is a deep enough understanding of the problem and how to solve it? Do you think technically, do the people in power understand the enormous scale of this task, and do they understand its importance measured against other issues such as machine emissions standards, for example?
I'm going to say yes and no here, because I do think policymakers know what the problem is. The others might not agree with me, but I don't think this is a problem of policymakers not understanding the scale of the problem. I think they very well understand the scale of the problem. Where I think they struggle is to understand how the solutions work. And of course, when it comes to a technical level, then they are policy experts. We in the industry are experts in our sectors, and there's a bit of a gap here. So I think that the problem is not lack of understanding the scale of the problem, it's how to really solve it. And when I was smiling at Adrian, it was absolutely not a criticism. It was the fact that there is going to need to be this massive scaling up exercise. Actually, engineers prefer bespoke solutions. They are not particularly into standard designs. But the reality is that, given that I was one of the first to admit that we have a skills shortage, we are going to have to solve this somehow. And I think it's that, really. And I just think that the policymakers just do not know how to solve this. I think if they did, they would have done it. I think that lack of the available finance is also an issue that they need to solve.
Yeah, and that's interesting because the report highlights a lack of financial incentives as one of the barriers to improvement in the retrofitting situation. And I'm interested to know who those incentives are primarily aimed at when they do appear. You know, would you say these are for builders or for owners? What's the mechanism? And again, why aren't there more incentives in place right now? Maybe this is a question for you, Adrian. What are you seeing there?
I think the question of incentives and financial packages is an important but again complex issue, and that's because buildings are owned by a very broad range of socioeconomic classes in society, and we have to think about buildings in different segments in order to address the financing challenge for each segment. When you look at public buildings, for example, so those that are owned or occupied by government, or owned or occupied by services such as library services, schools, hospitals, etc., this segment ought to be a no-brainer. It ought to be a segment that the governments who have signed, after all, the Climate Act and are committed to carbon neutral Europe by 2050, they ought to be just going ahead financing and putting retrofit programs into place for these categories of buildings. They're using public money, that's our money, for our benefit, and it should be a no-brainer. And happily, it is regulated in the Energy Efficiency Directive that 3% per year is to be renovated. We know it's not happening at that rate in that segment. When you come to the tertiary, the other non-residential buildings, so commercial buildings, depots, warehouses, etc., these are generally, as you know, subject to business planning or strategies for investment by companies. Again, here, this is a professional sector where it ought to be easy to imagine that incentives are not really required, because the bottom line can be improved in several different ways by energy renovating the tertiary or commercial building stock. The real crux comes in that last big segment of the residential building stock, which is very heterogeneous across Europe, which is occupied by a large range of different socioeconomic groups. And the ownership patterns of the residential building stock are very varied, from social housing through owner-occupied, through private rented, through other hybrid kind of ownership structures. And generally in Europe, it is the owner's creditworthiness that we target when we're thinking about granting money or giving a subsidy. And we tend to overlook the asset value of the property to be treated, which is more of a US perspective. And I say that because I know the study covered both continents, if I can put it that way. And if in the USA you take, as they do, the asset approach, the asset value of a renovated building is much higher than that of a non-renovated building. And this is becoming more and more evident as we move forward. And so in the financial world, you can leverage that asset value change for giving a loan or subsidizing a property. However, in Europe, it doesn't seem to it doesn't seem to be as attractive to us. We look at the creditworthiness of the owner before we decide that they deserve a subsidy or a loan from a bank. So maybe there's a mindset change needed in the financing of our building stock that takes a bit more of that US approach. I think the UK is probably in the same line as the US, but certainly continental Europe is not. And after you've then thought about those characteristic differences, you have to build different financing packages. The most vulnerable and lowest income people in Europe will require full subsidies to do this work. And from there, you go to the other end of the spectrum, people who need no subsidies because they're certainly well enough off to renovate their buildings. And in between those extremes, you have to have a variety of packages with different percentages of grant or subsidy, piggybacking on loans from financial institutions. And happily, a great deal of work is being done by the financial institutions to understand better the value of energy efficiency investments in homes. I'm talking specifically about homes. And they are seeing this as a long-term stable investment opportunity for long-term returns. So new models are coming on the market all the time to fit that middle segment with green mortgages and green loans that can then be aggregated to make green bonds that are then sent into the pension market, etc. So we are seeing progress in that field, but it is complex. It takes time, and maybe that's one of the things that we didn't value enough 10 years ago, is that it takes a long time to put these matters in place in the market, but they are coming on stream now. And my hope is that the general public will ask for these new products, and we will see an acceleration of renovation in the next 3 to 5 year period.
Brilliant, thank you, Adrian. I mean, Olwen, would you agree with what Adrian's saying? I mean, did you get to the root of this issue, where the money is coming from, where it's going or not going, when you were writing the report?
Yeah, I think I would agree wholeheartedly with what Adrian said. I have to say the report itself was probably focused more on the kind of backward looking, what has been the building emissions reductions or lack thereof, and the EPC changes. And then we did in the sections on case studies look at some financing options, but not into a huge level of depth, just given as Adrian's pointed out, across those 6 countries and the level of complexity and types of buildings, types of ownership structures. But I think the point about the green mortgage rollout was definitely something that came through in our research. And then also on the commercial side, I know we spotlighted an example in Canary Wharf of a green bond being raised to fund some retrofitting. And I think when you look at commercial building as well, and you look at the demand for office space that is now adhering to, or at least close to adhering to, net zero standards, that's increasing. And given post-COVID, with the market overall a bit softer on commercial building rentals, it's where there can be building owners can distinguish themselves, and so I think that is also helping to drive some incentives of retrofitting.
Yeah, well, that's a bit of good news. That's good. Maybe we should get back to the bad news. Bianca, how does Kingspan view this issue of barriers to retrofitting? How does Kingspan view that? The report talks about a lack of awareness of the problem among the general public. Do you see that?
Yeah, I think I think the benefits are probably not as well understood as kind of Adrian's already highlighted, you know, in the opening there, that there are multiple benefits to it, to the homeowner, to society in general as well. And I think that's not still really not well understood. The Irish Green Building Council looked at the kind of came up with in 2017, I believe it was. We worked on a study to understand what were the 10 things, you know, to work on to unlock renovation in the Irish market. And again, awareness and setting up of these one-stop shops came up as one of those things, you know, back then 6 years ago, that would help to address that problem. And I think it does, to a certain extent, help make it easier for the homeowner. But I do think more structured campaign of the benefits and helping people to really understand that is needed. You know, people will choose to renovate their kitchens, their bathrooms for, you know, cosmetic reasons, but do they fully understand the potential improvements in their bills and, you know, the value of their home through doing the renovation piece as well? Or, you know, maybe being able to get that lower cost loan because you are tackling the efficiency of the building as well. So I think we could do a better job of simplifying that and bringing the data to market to actually show people the benefits and sharing those best practices. But it is starting to emerge. We just need a lot more of it, I think.
Can I jump in and agree with Bianca and say that having reliable, independent information, ideally delivered through a local one-stop shop, is a crucial starting point. Today, most of the information that homeowners are getting are from installers. And installers, of course, like to install what they know, and they don't necessarily want to advise on the best product. I can't blame them for that. So for a homeowner who's not an expert in the building's technologies and the building fabric, getting independent advice is crucially important. And we are very, very supportive of the rollout of the one-stop shop model across Europe. We're in fact engaged in a couple of proposals for EU-funded projects to further propagate the models across the Central Eastern European and Baltic regions. And once they're in place, we also think they should give the full range of service, from the initial auditing and analysis of the building, through the advice on what should be done and in what stages, through the works itself, and on into the monitoring and commissioning of the building. Because even if all the best products are in the building and all the best equipment is installed for heating and cooling and ventilation, if it's not run properly and not properly commissioned, it's not going to perform the way you expect. And then you can get those bad stories arising. Often the commissioning of the building and helping the owner understand how to operate the building is missing, and then you get frustration. So this integrated home renovation service, as it's called, delivered through a one-stop shop, is really a powerful building block for moving the dial on building renovation.
Yeah, and maybe we should have sort of delved in earlier in the conversation, but, you know, can we outline some of the steps that need to be taken to effectively and efficiently reduce the carbon emissions of the existing building stock. Can we run through exactly what that means?
I guess I should start. I mean, I don't want to dodge the question, Mike, but of course there's very great heterogeneity in the building stock. So you can't describe a set of measures that can be applied to all buildings. However, in general, what you should look for is try and bring the energy needed for heating and cooling the building to the lowest possible amount. And once you've done that, you find it much easier to find multiple sources of non-carbon energy to heat and cool the building moving forward. So in that sense, thinking holistically about the building is really important, and getting then the right combination of measures into the building at the right time is crucially important. Now, if you can't afford it all in one go, bringing down the amount of energy needed is the best first step, because maybe you're not going to change your gas boiler, so you'll still emit fossil fuel emissions, but they'll be, say, half what they were before. And then later you can move to a non-carbon source, which might be district heating, it might be your own installation of solar, it might be a heat pump, it might be a geothermal borehole. So there's a number of solutions that are available that can be applied later. But all along the way, advice is needed to be sure that none of the steps you take are prejudicial to taking the next step at a later date. So having, let's say, a building renovation plan in hand is crucially important as well. And they, in our opinion, ought to be provided by the one-stop shops, or indeed with energy performance certificates when they are delivered to a home or building owner, and that they clearly set out the steps that that building can take to get to the zero emission building standard well before 2050, because we can't all be doing this in 2049. That's not the plan. We must do it along the way so that many, many buildings are getting to the standard many decades ahead.
Right, now that's two people now who have raised the issue of heat pumps, and I think because of that, I'm going to go to a question that's come in, a very practical question. I have a heat pump, but experience problems when low temperature is present. The heating of a 3-bed house is difficult and prolonged compared to that of a traditional carbon-fueled boiler. Are you stating that this is due to incorrect installation, or is it just the inefficiency of said heat pump to heat the property? Free advice here if anyone's willing to give it. Everyone's looking. Come on, Sue. First,
Sue, do you want to take it?
Adrian, you can take it if you like.
I was going to say it's always extremely difficult to give advice on a webinar to an individual case, because individual cases don't make good law, and we know that. We've had that experience across all of our lives. And heat pumps are, there are many different varieties and power outputs from heat pumps. And I read the question, it seems it's in a new build estate, and I don't know which country that's in. But one of the issues that jumped straight to my mind is how much quality assurance was applied and monitoring of the construction of the buildings. Because we have heard recent reports that when completed buildings are monitored for their actual energy consumption, they are often not reflected by the assessed consumption on the certificates or the rating that's given to the building. And so I don't know this estate, I don't know where it is, but it could be that the insulation, for example, is sagging in a cavity, and now there's a big heat hole going out of this person's building. And that's why the heat pump isn't doing the job, because normally, if it's a new estate, it should be built to nearly zero energy standards, which is the current standard, and therefore have a low heating and cooling demand, which is easily covered by a good heat pump installation. So good, yeah, it's my old message. It's a holistic approach that's needed. All of the elements, the fabric, the equipment that controls the ventilation, have to sing together. And that is what I can't say in this case. Has that been properly brought together? Has the sizing of the different elements been properly specified? And one would expect they were, but it seems this owner is not satisfied. So I can't answer the question, but maybe that gives a perspective of how the need for the right measures that are properly calibrated together is really crucial in the building sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes to what you were saying too. It's a shame when people are trying their best to do the right thing and the technology is letting them down. And speaking of technology, it wouldn't be a construction webinar without some discussion of technology. We've already touched on it. I'm interested to get the panel's take on whether or not technology and to what extent it can be brought to bear on this particular issue. So, Sue, if I can start with you, what are your thoughts on? I mean, you've touched on this already, but how far can technology go really in this issue?
I think it can go a long way. I was a big fan of what was emerging as technology when I was in FIEC, and I still am in the consulting engineering world. I think that we have, as was already mentioned by Olwyn, we have some of the solutions already, and some of those are also being tried in Horizon Europe projects. I noticed that there was a reference in one of the documents I read to the BIM Speak project, and when I was in FIEC, I was actually involved in that project, and I understood that the results were quite encouraging. So that's one example of where BIM has worked, but I think there's a lot of emerging technology, and we are only just finding out what the potential of this might be. We know, for example, that AI can help us to understand very quickly what works well and can analyze historical data to see where you might be able to scale up solutions. This applies to many, many things in construction, not only to retrofitting. I think that I would say give two caveats. One is that when we talk about in terms of how far you could go with technology, the technology is, as we've already heard, only as good as the person who's using it. So there is some cases that I have seen where there have been, for example, smart buildings, which is a slightly different thing, but they're not working as they were intended to because the users are not using the technology as it was intended to be used. So that's one caveat. And the other caveat that I would give is that BIM, although I'm a big fan of it and engineers are a big fan of it, you have to look at the very specific project that you have, because BIM is not cheap. And therefore, you have to look at things on a case-by-case basis. If you're making one step in a retrofit and not the entire thing, maybe BIM is not the right thing for you to use. But I think we should be looking at technology for scaling up, for what's emerging and for what potential we don't even know about yet that's coming. So yes, definitely.
Great. Thank you, Sue. Bianca, what about you? Does Kingspan utilize technology from a retrofitting or more general sustainability perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose two kind of things that are coming to my mind are to support with kind of labor issues. So we're currently working on a robot that could be used to kind of do the mechanical fixings on roofs for insulated panels. Because we've heard, from contractors that labor is obviously a big issue. So that's something that we're working on at the moment. It's still very much in prototype phase. But again, it's thinking about how can you support your customers. The product is faster to install, obviously, because it's a panelized system. But again, is there a way you can help them to speed that up and help them to deal with their challenges? And then just another idea as well from the one-stop shop as well, like just using a digitized system to be able to manage the administration of a growing, program like that. The Irish government tends to be quite paper-based still. It's obviously moving into the digital era now as well. So I think technology will play a big role actually in being able to scale all of that administration work to make it more streamlined and to actually help be able to do the renovations at a rate as well, and to be able to coordinate it all. I think it could play a big role there as well.
Brilliant. And Adrian, can I come to you on that as well? Technology, where does it sit in this?
Well, when I hear the word technology, I don't just think about digitalization or robots and computers and so on. Technology is also the panels that Kingspan make. It's the way they go together. Technology is also windows, glass, the actual products. These are technologically produced products that, as I said before, need to go together in the right combinations to give highly energy performing buildings. And we say it all the time that the technologies needed for this challenge of retrofitting exist today, but clearly and frustratingly are not being rolled out fast enough into the market. So somewhere along the way, new technologies are seen or perceived by the general public as attractive. We seem to be risk takers when it comes to new technology. And a lot of the technologies are tried and tested, and we don't seem to be too interested in them. We kind of overlook them. So somewhere there's a need. It would be nice to think that the existing tried and tested technologies could be seen in a better light moving forward. And maybe this earlier topic of industrializing the process or going to off-site construction with those existing technologies, with those existing materials, but then assembled in a new way, is something that maybe could excite. And there, because of the need for mass customization, the digital tools, the BIM tools need to come to the fore. The 3D surveying with drones, etc. All these very sexy things that young people really like to play with come to the fore. So across the board, yeah, technologies exist. There are always emerging technologies, but I wouldn't overemphasize them in the retrofit challenge.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think that's about all we have time for, unfortunately. We've run quite long, actually, but it's a fascinating issue. Slightly depressing in some ways, but a few glimmers of light out there, and a really fascinating report. So thank you all for joining me. Thank you, Sue, Adrian, Bianca, Olwyn. Thank you all very much. So really, it just remains for me to say thank you once again to Kingspan for supporting this webinar, and a huge thank you to you for taking the time to be with us. Hope you found it useful, and you join us for more webinars in the future. I should just say that those of you who have joined today and those of you who registered will receive a link to the report to download, so you can see all of the report, which is much more detailed than the sort of executive summary that you saw from Olwyn today. So yes, I hope you found it useful, enjoyed it, and we'll see you all again next time. Thanks very much.